Picture this, a dusty frontier town where the sun beats down mercilessly and cruel words can cut deeper than any blade. In this unforgiving landscape of the American West, a young woman's spirit is about to be transformed by the most unexpected encounter. What happens when a stranger sees beauty where others see only flaws? This is a story that will remind you that sometimes it takes just one person to change everything. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories from the Old West. Hit that bell icon to never miss our latest tales of courage, hope, and human connection. The year was 1887, and the town of Copper Ridge, Arizona, baked under the relentless desert sun like a forgotten biscuit in an oven. Dust devils danced between the weathered buildings, and the only sounds that broke the afternoon. Silence with a distant lowing of cattle and the occasional creak of the saloon's swinging doors. Claire Morrison sat on the wooden steps of Henderson's general store, her thick spectacles reflecting the harsh sunlight as she carefully mended a torn dress. At 19, she possessed a quiet intelligence that shone through her gentle brown eyes, magnified behind the heavy lenses that had become both her necessity and her burden. "Well, look what we have here," came a mocking voice that made Claire's shoulders tense. Four Eyes is at it again. Hiding behind those bottle-thick glasses, Margaret Whitfield approached with her usual entourage of followers, their expensive dresses a stark contrast to Claire's simple, patched clothing. Margaret's father owned the largest ranch in the territory, and she wielded her social position like a weapon against anyone she deemed beneath her. "I swear, Claire, those glasses are so thick, you could start a fire with them," laughed Sarah Jenkins, Margaret's closest companion. "Maybe that's why no man in town will even look your way." Claire's fingers trembled as she continued her needlework, refusing to look up. She had learned long ago that responding only made the torment worse. The thick lenses had been a necessity since childhood. Without them, the world became a blur of shapes and shadows. But in a town where a woman's worth was often measured by her appearance and her prospects for marriage, Claire's glasses had marked her as different, undesirable. "Cat got your tongue, Four Eyes?" Margaret pressed, stepping closer. "Or maybe you just can't see us properly through those ridiculous things." The other girls giggled cruelly, their laughter echoing off the store's wooden facade. Claire felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "You know," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "my father says the railroad's bringing in new families next month. Maybe one of them will have a son desperate enough to court the town's old maid. Though I suppose even desperation has its limits." The words hit Claire like physical blows. At 19, she was hardly an old maid, but in a frontier town where girls often married by 16, she was beginning to feel the weight of spinsterhood settling on her shoulders like dust on an unused shelf. "That's enough." The voice was deep, unfamiliar, and carried an authority that made everyone freeze. Claire looked up to see a tall figure approaching from the direction of the saloon. The man wore a weathered brown hat pulled low over his eyes, and his long coat bore the dust of many miles. A pair of well-worn boots clicked against the wooden boardwalk as he drew closer. "I said that's enough," he repeated, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I believe the lady would prefer to be left in peace." Margaret straightened, her cheeks flushing with indignation. "Excuse me, but this is none of your concern, stranger. We're just having a friendly conversation with Claire here." The cowboy stopped a few feet away, and Claire caught a glimpse of steel-gray eyes beneath the brim of his hat. There was something in his gaze that made her heart skip, not fear, but a kind of quiet strength she had never encountered before. "Didn't sound particularly friendly from where I was standing," he said, his tone remaining level. "Sounded more like a pack of coyotes circling something they thought was wounded." Sarah gasped at the comparison, and Margaret's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "How dare you? Do you have any idea who I am?" "Can't say I do," the stranger replied with a slight shrug. "And can't say I much care. What I do know is that a real lady doesn't need to tear others down to feel tall." The silence that followed was deafening. In all her years of enduring Margaret's cruelty, no one had ever stood up for Claire. The townspeople either feared the Whitfield family's influence or simply didn't care enough to intervene. Margaret sputtered for a moment, clearly unused to being challenged. This is outrageous. Come on, girls. We don't need to associate with riffraff." As the group of young women hurried away, their skirts rustling with indignation, Claire found herself alone with the mysterious stranger. She kept her eyes fixed on her needlework, unsure of what to say or do. "You all right, miss?" the cowboy asked, his voice gentler now. Claire nodded without looking up, not trusting her voice. She could feel his presence nearby, solid and reassuring, in a way that was entirely foreign to her. "Name's Jake Sullivan," he said, settling onto the step beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Just rode in from Colorado. Heard there might be work to be had at one of the ranches hereabouts. Claire Morrison," she managed to whisper, still focused on her sewing. "Pleased to make your acquaintance. Miss Morrison." There was genuine warmth in his voice that made something flutter in Claire's chest. "That's fine needlework you're doing there. My mother used to sew like that, said it took patience and a steady hand." For the first time, Claire risked a glance upward. Jake Sullivan was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. His brown hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges beneath his hat, and there was a gentleness in his expression that contradicted his rugged appearance. "Thank you," she said softly. For what you did. You didn't have to." Jake's expression grew serious. "Yes, I did. Where I come from, a man protects those who can't protect themselves. And no one deserves to be spoken to like that, especially not someone who's done nothing wrong." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes again. But this time, they weren't tears of humiliation. When was the last time someone had shown her such simple kindness? "I should go," she said, gathering her sewing supplies. "Mrs. Henderson will be wondering where I am." As she stood to leave, Jake rose as well, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I hope I'll see you around town, Miss Morrison. And for what it's worth." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones others are too blind to see." Claire hurried into the general store, her heart pounding and her cheeks burning. Behind her, she could hear Jake's boots on the boardwalk as he walked away, but his words echoed in her mind long after the sound had faded. 3 days passed before Claire saw Jake Sullivan again. She had spent those days replaying their brief encounter, wondering if she had imagined the kindness in his voice or the way he had looked at her, not through her, as most people did, but directly at her, as if she were worth seeing. The morning was crisp for late September, with a hint of autumn in the air that promised relief from the summer's brutal heat. Claire was sweeping the front steps of the general store when she heard the familiar sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw Jake riding down Main Street on a sturdy bay gelding, his posture easy and confident in the saddle. He spotted her and touched his hat in greeting, guiding his horse toward the hitching post in front of the store. Claire's pulse quickened, and she found herself smoothing her simple blue dress and checking that her hair was still neatly pinned beneath her bonnet. "Morning, Miss Morrison," Jake said as he dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," Claire replied, pleased that her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Yes, it's lovely. The heat's finally starting to break. That it is." Jake secured his horse and approached the steps where Claire stood. "I was hoping I might find you here." "I wanted to thank you." Claire blinked in surprise, her glasses sliding slightly down her nose. She pushed them back up with a nervous gesture. "Thank me? Whatever for?" "For the recommendation," Jake said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "You mentioned Mrs. Henderson, and when I asked around, folks said she might know of work. Turns out she put in a good word for me with Tom Bradley at the Circle B Ranch. I start tomorrow." "Oh," Claire said, feeling a flush of pleasure at having been helpful. "I'm so glad. Mr. Bradley is a good man, fair and honest. You'll like working for him. I'm sure I will." Jake paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I was wondering, that is, if it wouldn't be too forward of me. Would you perhaps like to take a walk this evening? After you're finished with your work, of course. I'd like to see more of the town, and I thought you might be willing to show me around." Claire's heart leaped, but doubt quickly followed. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see Margaret and her friends lurking nearby, ready to mock this unexpected development. I don't know," she stammered. "People might talk, let them," Jake said simply. "I'm asking you to take a walk with me, Miss Morrison, not to run away and join the circus. Though if that's what you wanted to do, I'd probably say yes to that too." The unexpected humor in his voice made Claire smile, despite her nervousness. "You don't know me very well, Mr. Sullivan. I'm not exactly... That is, I'm not the sort of woman men usually what?" Though Jake's voice was gentle but insistent, Claire struggled to find the words. How could she explain a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, made to feel invisible? "I'm not the sort of woman men usually notice," she finished quietly. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when Claire dared to look up at him, she found his grey eyes serious and intent. "Then they're fools," he said simply. "Every last one of them. The sincerity in his voice took Claire's breath away. She had spent so many years believing the cruel words others had spoken about her, that hearing someone speak of her with such conviction felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. "I finish work at 6, she heard herself saying. "Mrs. Henderson closes the store then." Jake's smile returned, warm and genuine. "I'll be here at 6:15 if that suits you." "Yes," Claire said, her own smile beginning to bloom. "Yes, that would be lovely." As Jake tipped his hat and headed into the store to conduct his business, Claire found herself humming softly as she continued her sweeping. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had something to look forward to. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Claire found herself checking her reflection in every available surface, adjusting her glasses and smoothing her hair. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman in her 50s, who had always treated Claire with maternal affection, noticed her distraction immediately. "You're jumpy as a cat in a thunderstorm today, dear," Mrs. Henderson observed as Claire nearly dropped a jar of preserves while stocking shelves. "Something on your mind?" Claire felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Sullivan asked me to take a walk with him this evening." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose in surprise, then her face broke into a pleased smile. "Did he now? Well, that's wonderful news. He seems like a decent sort, polite, respectful. And Lord knows it's about time someone in this town had the sense to appreciate what a treasure you are." "Mrs. Henderson," Claire protested. But the older woman waved her objections away. "Don't you Mrs. Henderson me, Claire Morrison. I've watched you grow up, and I've seen how some of the young people in this town have treated you. It's shameful is what it is. You're worth 10 of that Margaret Whitfield, and anyone with eyes can see it." Claire ducked her head, overwhelmed by the unexpected support. I don't want to get my hopes up. He's probably just being kind." "Kindness is a fine thing," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "but a man doesn't ask a woman to walk with him just to be polite. Mark my words, that young man sees something special in you. The question is, do you see it in yourself?" As 6 o'clock approached, Claire's nervousness reached new heights. She had changed her dress twice, settling finally on her best Sunday frock, a deep green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She had also taken extra care with her hair, pinning it up in a style that was both neat and flattering. When Jake appeared at precisely 6:15, Claire was waiting on the store's front steps, her hands folded carefully in her lap. He had clearly made an effort as well. His shirt was clean and pressed, his boots polished, and he had shaved since that morning. "You look lovely, Miss Morrison," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" As they began their walk down Main Street, Claire was acutely aware of the curious glances they received. Some were merely interested, but others carried the weight of judgment and speculation. She found herself tensing, waiting for someone to make a cruel comment or laugh at the unlikely pair they made. "Relax," Jake said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Just focus on me, not them." "It's not that simple," Claire murmured. "You don't understand what it's like here. People talk, and they're not always kind." "Then we'll give them something worth talking about," Jake replied with a grin that made Claire's heart skip. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Morrison. What do you like to do when you're not working at the store?" As they walked, Claire found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told him about her love of reading, how she devoured every book that came through the store, and often read late into the night by lamplight. She spoke of her dreams of seeing the ocean someday, of visiting the great cities she had read about in newspapers and novels. Jake listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own stories of life on the trail. He had been born in Texas, he told her, but had spent the last decade moving from place to place, working ranches and learning the land. He spoke of vast skies and endless horizons, of nights spent under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "What made you stop here?" Claire asked as they paused beside the small creek that ran along the edge of town. The water gurgled softly over smooth stones, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I suppose I got tired of running," he said finally. "A man can only drift for so long before he starts looking for a place to put down roots. And you think Copper Ridge might be that place?" Jake turned to look at her, and something in his expression made Claire's breath catch. "I'm beginning to think it might be." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Claire had never felt so at peace, so completely herself, as she did in this moment with this unexpected man who had wandered into her life like a character from one of her beloved novels. "Miss Morrison," Jake said suddenly, his voice soft but serious, "may I ask you something?" Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. Why do you let them treat you the way they do? Those girls, I mean. You're clearly intelligent, kind, capable. Why don't you stand up for yourself? The question hit Claire like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was so honest. She had asked herself the same thing countless times, usually in the dark hours of the night when sleep eluded her. Because, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, when you hear something often enough, you start to believe it's true. When everyone around you treats you like you're invisible, or worse, like you're something to be pitied or mocked, it becomes easier to just accept it than to fight it. Jake's expression grew pained. That's no way to live, Claire. The use of her first name sent a shiver through her, intimate and warm. It's the only way I know how to live. Then maybe, Jake said, stepping closer, it's time you learned a different way. The next few weeks brought changes to Copper Ridge that no one could have anticipated, least of all Claire herself. Jake's presence in her life had begun to work a quiet transformation, like water slowly reshaping stone. Where once she had hurried through town with her head down, avoiding eye contact, she now walked with a straighter spine and lifted chin. It helped that Jake made a point of seeking her out whenever he came to town. After long days working at the Circle B ranch, he would often stop by the general store just as Claire was finishing her duties. Sometimes they would walk together, exploring the dusty streets and talking about everything and nothing. Other times, they would sit on the store's front steps, watching the world go by as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The townspeople had begun to take notice, and opinions were decidedly mixed. Some, like Mrs. Henderson and the kindly Dr. Matthews, seemed pleased to see Claire coming out of her shell. Others, particularly those in Margaret Whitfield's social circle, viewed the development with suspicion and barely concealed disdain. I simply don't understand what he sees in her. Claire overheard Margaret saying to Sarah Jenkins as they browsed the store's fabric selection one afternoon. She's so plain, and those awful glasses make her look like an owl. Claire's hands stilled on the inventory ledger she was updating, but she forced herself to continue writing. The words still stung, but somehow they didn't cut as deeply as they once had. Jake's voice echoed in her memory. Then they're fools, every last one of them. Maybe he feels sorry for her, Sarah suggested with a cruel laugh. See, you know how some men are? They like to play the hero with wounded creatures. Well, he'll tire of it soon enough, Margaret replied dismissively. Men like that don't settle down with women like her. Mark my words, he'll move on to someone more suitable. That evening, as Claire and Jake sat by the creek, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, she found herself unusually quiet. The conversation she had overheard played on repeat in her mind, feeding the old doubts and insecurities she had thought were beginning to fade. You're troubled about something, Jake observed, his voice gentle in the gathering darkness. Want to talk about it? Claire hesitated, then found herself telling him about Margaret's words. As she spoke, she watched Jake's expression grow increasingly grim. And you believe her? He asked when she finished. Claire struggled with the answer. I don't want to. But she's not entirely wrong, is she? You could have your pick of women in this town, or any town. Why would you choose someone like me? Jake was quiet for so long that Claire began to fear she had offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. Look up, Claire. Confused, she tilted her head back to gaze at the star-filled sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and countless stars twinkled in the clear desert air. What do you see? Jake asked. Stars, Claire replied, uncertain where he was leading. How many? I don't know. Hundreds? Thousands? More than that, Jake said softly. More than anyone could ever count. And every single one of them is different. Different sizes, different brightness, different colors, if you know how to look. Some people might look up there and only notice the biggest, brightest ones. But that doesn't make the others any less beautiful, does it? Claire felt her throat tighten with emotion. Jake, your eyes, he continued, turning to face her fully, hold all the stars, Claire. Every time you look at something, really look at it, I can see the wonder there, the intelligence, the kindness. When you read, when you're thinking about something that interests you, when you smile, it's like watching starlight. Tears began to slip down Claire's cheeks, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid them. You don't have to say things like that just to make me feel better. I'm not, Jake said firmly. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently removed her glasses. Without them, his face became a soft blur, but she could still see the earnestness in his expression. I'm saying it because it's true, because someone should have told you long ago how extraordinary you are. I can't see you properly without those, Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Then let me be your eyes for a moment, Jake replied. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. I see a woman who works harder than anyone else in this town and never complains. I see someone who reads voraciously because she's hungry for knowledge, for understanding, for connection with the wider world. I see kindness in the way you treat Mrs. Henderson, patience in how you handle difficult customers, and strength in how you've endured years of cruelty without letting it make you cruel in return. Claire's breath came in short gasps, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words and his proximity. Jake, I see a woman, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, who is so beautiful it takes my breath away, not in spite of her glasses, but because of everything she is, her mind, her heart, her spirit. And if the people in this town are too blind to see that, then they don't deserve to know you. Before Claire could respond, Jake leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle, so reverent, that it felt like a prayer. Claire had never been kissed before, had never imagined that such tenderness was possible. When they finally parted, she was trembling. Your eyes hold all the stars, Jake whispered against her forehead. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. As he carefully replaced her glasses, Claire felt something fundamental shift inside her. For the first time in her life, she began to see herself through someone else's eyes, not the cruel, mocking gaze of her tormentors, but the loving, appreciative eyes of a man who truly saw her. I love you, Claire Morrison, Jake said simply. I know it's soon, and I know I'm just a drifting cowboy with more dust than dollars to my name, but I love you. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving to you just how extraordinary you are. Claire's heart felt as though it might burst from her chest. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on her lips. I never imagined that someone could love you, Jake finished gently. Well, now you know, and I plan to remind you every day for the rest of our lives, if you'll let me. As they sat together under the vast canopy of stars, Claire felt the last of her old fears and insecurities beginning to crumble. She was still the same woman who wore thick glasses and worked in a general store, but she was also so much more. She was loved, valued, cherished, and for the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe she deserved to be. 6 months later, the town of Copper Ridge was buzzing with preparations for what many were calling the wedding of the decade, though not necessarily for the reasons one might expect. Claire Morrison and Jake Sullivan's engagement had sent shockwaves through the small community, dividing opinion and sparking countless conversations in parlors, saloons, and shops throughout the territory. Claire stood before the mirror in Mrs. Henderson's back room, adjusting the simple but elegant white dress that the older woman had helped her sew. It was made of fine cotton with delicate lace trim, modest yet beautiful in its simplicity. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate updo that Mrs. Henderson had spent the morning perfecting, and her glasses, polished to a shine, reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. You look absolutely radiant, dear, Mrs. Henderson said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. I've never seen you so happy. Claire smiled, and it was true. Happiness seemed to radiate from her very being. The past months had been a revelation. With Jake's unwavering support and encouragement, she had begun to blossom in ways she never thought possible. She spoke up more in conversations, offered her opinions freely, and had even started a small lending library in the back of the general store, sharing her beloved books with anyone who was interested. I still can't quite believe it's real, Claire admitted, smoothing her skirts nervously. Sometimes I wake up thinking it's all been a wonderful dream. It's real, all right, Mrs. Henderson assured her. And that young man of yours is the luckiest fellow in the territory. He knows it too. I can see it in his eyes every time he looks at you. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Come in, Mrs. Henderson called. To Claire's surprise, Dr. Matthews entered, followed by his wife Eleanor, and several other women from the town, women who had never paid her much attention before, but who had gradually begun to treat her with newfound respect as they witnessed her transformation. We wanted to wish you well before the ceremony, Dr. Matthews said kindly, and to give you this. Eleanor stepped forward, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, desert lupines, Indian paintbrush, and prickly pear blossoms that somehow managed to look both wild and elegant. We picked them this morning from the hills outside town. We thought they suited you. Claire accepted the bouquet with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you all so much. As the women filed out to take their seats for the ceremony, Mrs. Henderson squeezed Claire's hand. "It's time, dear. Your future is waiting." The wedding was to be held in the small church at the end of Main Street, with Reverend Thompson officiating. As Claire walked down the dusty road toward the church, her arm linked through Dr. Matthews, who had graciously agreed to give her away in the absence of her late father. She was amazed by the number of people who had come to witness the ceremony. It seemed as though the entire town had turned out, and Claire was touched to see genuine smiles and well wishes from faces that had once regarded her with indifference or pity. Even some of Margaret's former followers had begun to treat her differently, as if Jake's love had somehow made her worthy of their notice. Margaret herself was notably absent, having left town the previous month to visit relatives in San Francisco, a departure that many suspected was more permanent than temporary. Her absence felt like the lifting of a dark cloud, allowing Claire to step fully into the sunlight of her new life. As they reached the church steps, Claire caught sight of Jake waiting at the altar, and her breath caught in her throat. He wore his best suit, a dark blue that brought out his eyes, and his hair was neatly combed. But it was the expression on his face that made her heart soar, pure, undiluted love and admiration that made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of joy and emotion. Claire found herself focusing on Jake's steady grey eyes, drawing strength from his presence as they exchanged vows that promised a lifetime of love, support, and partnership. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake lifted her veil to kiss her, Claire felt as though she were floating among the stars themselves. The reception was held in the town square, with tables laden with food, contributed by various families, and a small band providing music for dancing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jake led Claire onto the makeshift dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. "How does it feel, Mrs. Sullivan?" Jake asked as they swayed to the gentle melody, his arms strong and sure around her. "Like a dream," Claire replied, gazing up at him with wonder. "A beautiful, impossible dream that I never want to wake up from." "Then don't," Jake said, spinning her gently. "This is just the beginning, Claire. We have a whole lifetime of dreams ahead of us." As the evening wore on, Claire found herself surrounded by well-wishers and friends, people who had once overlooked her but who now seemed to truly see her for the first time. Mrs. Henderson regaled anyone who would listen with stories of Claire's intelligence and kindness, while Dr. Matthews spoke admiringly of her extensive knowledge of literature and current events. "You know," said Tom Bradley, Jake's employer at the Circle B Ranch, as he approached the newlyweds during a break in the dancing, "I've been thinking about expanding the ranch's operations. We could use someone with a head for numbers and organization to help manage the books and correspondence. Would you be interested in the position, Mrs. Sullivan?" Claire's eyes widened in surprise. The offer represented more than just employment. It was recognition of her abilities, an acknowledgement that she had value beyond her role as someone's wife. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I would be very interested." Jake squeezed her hand, his pride evident in his smile. "My wife is the smartest person I know," he told Tom. "You won't find anyone better for the job." As the celebration continued around them, Claire and Jake slipped away for a few moments of quiet together. They walked to the edge of town, where the lights of the party faded and the vast desert sky opened up above them, filled with countless stars. "Look up," Jake said, echoing the words he had spoken to her months earlier by the creek. Claire tilted her head back, and through her glasses the stars seemed to sparkle with extra brilliance. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Jake agreed, but when Claire looked at him she found his gaze fixed on her face rather than the sky. "They are." "Jake Sullivan," Claire said with a laugh, "are you comparing me to the stars again?" "Always," he replied seriously. "Because that's what you are to me, Claire. You're my guiding star, my light in the darkness. And every time I look at you, I see the whole universe reflected in your eyes." Claire reached up to touch his face, marveling at how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely, overlooked young woman who believed herself unworthy of love. Now she was a wife, soon to be a businesswoman in her own right, surrounded by people who valued and respected her. "Your eyes hold all the stars." Jake had told her that first night, and now Claire finally understood what he meant. It wasn't about the stars themselves. It was about the capacity for wonder, for love, for seeing beauty in the world and in oneself. It was about recognizing that every person, no matter how overlooked or undervalued, carried within them the light of infinite possibility. "Thank you," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For what?" "For seeing me," she said simply. "For helping me see myself." Jake pulled her close, and as they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Claire felt the truth of her new life settling into her bones. She was no longer the girl who hid behind thick glasses and silence. She was Claire Sullivan, wife, partner, dreamer, and her eyes truly did hold all the stars. In the distance, the sounds of celebration continued, but here in their private moment, the world belonged to just the two of them. And as Jake kissed her under the starlit sky, Claire knew that this was only the beginning of their story, a story that would be written in starlight and filled with all the love, adventure, and possibility that the vast frontier could offer. The girl who had once been mocked for her glasses had found her place in the world, not by changing who she was, but by learning to see herself through the eyes of love. And in that seeing, she had discovered that she was, and always had been, exactly as beautiful and worthy as the stars themselves. Thank you for joining us for this heartwarming tale from the Old West. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of courage, love, and transformation. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner light, and let us know in the comments which story you'd like to hear next. Until next time, remember, we all carry stars in our eyes, waiting for the right person to help us see them shine.